Arkham Audio presents Arkham Investigator Skids Otoole, narrated by Walker Schlunt. All copyrights belong to Fantasy Flight Games. If you enjoyed this production, you can find this story and many more in the Investigators of Arkham book. Skids Otoole, the ex-con. "Morning, Skids," Detective Kennedy quipped as he entered the interrogation room. It was 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning, and the veteran Arkham police detective was insufferably cheerful. He was a big, broad-shouldered Irishman with a thick shock of blonde hair, icy blue eyes, and a boxer's crooked nose. Dressed in shirt sleeves, he carried a mug of watery break room coffee in each hand and had a thick file folder tucked under his arm. At the table sat an average-sized, not quite middle-aged, dark-haired man in a rumpled brown suit. He smelled strongly of cheap cigars and illicit spirits. Skids Otoole looked up at the detective and smiled. He was surprisingly at ease for an ex-con on probation that had been picked up at a blind pig on suspicion of robbing a bank. "Good morning yourself, detective. How's Mrs. Kennedy?" "Oh, she's blooming, Skids, just blooming." Kennedy set one of the cups of coffee in front of Skids and sat down across the table from him. The detective placed the folder on the table and took a pull at his coffee. "This is terrible." He made a face and set the mug down. "So tell me, what was going on at Hibbs last night?" "You tell me," Skids replied. "It should all be there in your officer's report." "Oh, it is, but I'd like to hear it straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. What were you doing last night?" It was Friday night, and Skids walked into Hibbs Roadhouse like he owned the joint. Hibbs was an old carriage stop on the Arkham Pike, halfway between Arkham and Salem. Officially, the place was straight, serving nothing but lunches, dinners, and birch beer since the Volstead Act was passed. On certain nights, however, the mask of rustic legitimacy slipped, and people came from all over to collectively let their hair down. Old man Hibbard, the owner, called these nights social nights. He would get a band in from Boston, break out the good liquor hidden behind the false wall in the basement, and invite a few of his closest friends over for a good time. This was such a night. The dance floor was packed with people dancing the Charleston and Lindy Hop as a traveling band belted out a string of Jelly Roll Morton, Cole Porter, and Louis Armstrong tunes. Diners in their best clothes sat at tables around the dance floor's perimeter, watching the dancers and toying with their dinners. Smoke hung over the entire scene, and the air was electric. Skids made his way through the crowd, nodding now and then to friends and acquaintances. There was his old friend Ryan Dean in a dark blue cashmere suit, chatting up a pretty young thing in a black shift dress and embroidered cloche. He caught Dean's eye, and the handsome young man dropped him a conspiratorial wink. Stopping at the bar, Skids ordered a highball and exchanged a few desultory words with a lovely young lady sitting there. After a few minutes, he headed for the back room where the poker tables were. "Oh, so you were just there having dinner, were you?" asked the smiling detective. "Were you there all by yourself?" "Just me," answered Skids. "I understand Mr. Hibbard throws a good party. Who else was there?" "Oh, now, detective, I couldn't say. Lots of people. It was crowded, and I was just there for dinner and the music. You know, I did see old Abner there last night. You know how he gets around." The detective snorted. "Do any drinking?" Kennedy asked. Skids feigned mild shock. "Drinking is illegal, detective, and I'm on probation. A man in my position would be a fool to risk his rehabilitation for the sake of a drink." "Is that a fact?" "That's a fact." Kennedy made a clucking noise with his tongue and opened the folder on the table before him. The top sheet was Skids' rap sheet, with his mug shot clipped to it. He shuffled through the papers for a moment, and Skids leaned forward a bit to watch. "Here it is," muttered Kennedy, and he drew a sheet from the stack. "What is this all about, anyway, detective?" Skids asked. "All Officer Ames said is that you wanted to talk to me. If you had wanted to hear about my evening, you could have called me at the halfway house." "You ever been to Sutton, Skids?" Skids hesitated a moment, thrown off by the detective's question. "That's up on Bolton, right?" I've driven through it a few times, but I can't say I've ever been there. Why do you ask? Well, said Detective Kennedy, Sutton has a nice bank, see? A lot of farmers and fishermen use it because it has a good reputation. Last night, someone knocked that bank over, Skids. Know anything about that? The little gambling parlor Hibbard had set up in the back of the roadhouse was quieter, and the atmosphere more intense than the raucous dance hall Skids had just left. Perhaps 24 men were gathered there, drinking Hibbard's excellent Canadian whiskey, smoking expensive cigars, and playing some high-stakes poker. Skids exchanged a small sum of money for a handful of homemade wooden chips from the cashier, an elderly retired sheriff's deputy with a huge Colt revolver in his shoulder rig, and sat down at the first open seat he found. Ever since he had been released from prison, Skids had found little pleasure in anything save for gambling. Nothing compared to going all in and risking everything on the turn of a single card. Happily for him, he was ridiculously lucky and made a tidy sum at blackjack to supplement his meager earnings at the A&P. The dealer, an old friend, gave Skids a warm smile as he slid into the chair. Skids laid out his chips and anteed up, and the game began. For 2 straight hours, Skids ran the table. Over and over again, the cards came up in his favor, and the chips piled up in front of him. Eventually, Skids felt his luck slipping. After a handful of losses, he cashed out with a respectable sum and walked back into the dance hall for another drink. Make it easy on yourself, Skids. Give me the truth of it. Was the A&P just not paying you enough? Did you have another sick relative to care for? Kennedy leered across the table at Skids. The change from affable Officer Pat to hard-nosed Detective Kennedy had happened in a flash. Skids' hands balled into fists as he tried to contain a sudden surge of anger. How dare this smug copper make light of his mother's death? Skids counted slowly to 10 and said carefully and evenly, If you're charging me, Detective Kennedy, then I'm going to need my lawyer present. Is that what's going on here? Are you charging me with bank robbery? Kennedy knew he'd hit home with his sick relative remark and decided to back off a bit. Nah, Skids. We're just having a friendly conversation. I'm just concerned for you is all. You're a young man with a lot of life ahead of you, and I'd hate to see you spend more of it in the state pen. Now how's about you tell me the truth? I told you, Detective, that I was at Hibbs last night. I was nowhere near Sutton, and I don't know anything about a bank getting robbed. Is that so? That's so. That's not what the rat says. Skids was enjoying his Friday evening more than he'd enjoyed anything in a long while. Tonight's band was fantastic. He'd been extremely lucky at cards, and his conversation with another handsome young woman at the bar seemed to be going places. He'd bought her a drink, she'd returned the favor, and they'd taken a turn on the dance floor. After a few songs, they'd returned to the bar, laughing and breathing hard with the exertion. As they were sidling back up to the bar, Skids caught a glimpse of Old Man Hibbard having a heated conversation with the bartender. Hibbard was visibly shaken, and he was gesturing wildly at the bottles behind the bar. A cold chill ran through Skids. He quickly made an excuse to his lady friend, threw a couple of bucks on the bar, and moved toward the back door. No sooner was he in the backyard than he heard cars screeching to a halt in the street in front of the roadhouse. There was a loud bang as the front door was kicked in. He heard a man shouting. A woman screamed, and then the whole place erupted in pandemonium. Skids lit out for a nearby stand of trees, waited maybe 10 minutes, and then took a long and winding path back toward the Arkham Pike. He'd had enough excitement for one night. The rat, said Skids flatly. Joey the rat. Joey Vigil. That rat? Kennedy, you know full well that the rat would snitch on anyone, at any time. Truth be damned if the price was right. That's Detective Kennedy to you, Skids, said Kennedy coldly. And yes, Joey the rat, Vigil. We rounded him up this morning after you'd brought him in, and he said you'd asked him to move some goods for him last night. Oh, really? You believe that? What was I supposed to have stolen from that bank, Detective? The Hope Diamond? Kennedy slid a photo across the table to Skids. It showed a collection of gaudy, extremely ugly jewelry laid out in a satin-lined box. There was an oddly shaped thing like a tiara, but not one made for a human head. A huge heavy necklace with a massive green stone pendant and 4 rings with smoky blue stones. There was something familiar about them, but he couldn't place them. Kennedy rattled on about the bank job, but Skids heard precious little of it. He was studying the photo, searching it. Something in the strange design of the jewelry, something reminiscent of waves and sea creatures, nagged at him. He'd seen it before, he knew it. If he could only remember. The word marsh penetrated his reverie, and he snapped out of it. "What'd you say?" "I said that one of the safe deposit boxes taken belonged to a Mr. Adelard Marsh of Innsmouth. That jewelry was inside." Suddenly it clicked. He remembered where he'd seen designs like these before. His old cellmate, a multiple murderer and certified madman named Brad Hollins, had scratched them and a number of strange symbols into the wall near his bunk. That was before the accident. Accident. What else could you call it when a man suddenly bursts into flame and burned for no reason in a locked prison cell? A cold chill gripped him. He'd only heard of the Marsh family in passing, a wealthy old family from Innsmouth that had made its money in the previous century. Its members were widely rumored to be extremely eccentric. "Kennedy," he said slowly, "I swear to you on my mother's grave that I didn't have anything to do with that bank job." Kennedy looked taken aback by the conviction behind Skids' word. "I've never seen this jewelry, and I haven't seen or spoken to the rat since he did a hitch with me 3 years ago. I have seen this before, though," Skids said, pointing to an ornate detail in the strange tiara that looked like a squid. "And if you give me a chance, I might be able to help you find the guys who knocked your bank over."